men should know where the clitoris is. That should be something that is taught, given that so many people are heterosexual. And, I think that should be integrated into our education system.
I'm dying over here. That was fucking hilarious. Must have struck a chord for some reason.
Yeah,
I don't know,
I
but
wonder
like,
why. Why did you find that so funny?
I almost fell out of my chair over here. But like,
Yeah.
as a heterosexual male, and a recovering nice guy people pleaser, I mean,
Mm.
hell, it was almost like my personal mission to find that body part. Hey guys, welcome back to the Believe, Be Real, Be Bold podcast. I'm honored to be joined by my guest, Dr. Kristen Mark. How are you?
Good. How are you?
I'm fantastic. Now, before we get started, I want to remind the audience that this is one of those episodes where you're going to want to grab a pen and paper because we're going to blow the roof off of our conversation.
Sounds fun.
But before we jump in, I want to get to know you a little bit better. And what was it like moving across the country during a pandemic or quarantine?
Yeah, it's been pretty interesting. Very different. Like, I don't know anyone in my new city, and so it's really hard to obviously connect with people during a pandemic. So I'm just sort of focusing on work and getting my house how I like it.
Mm-hmm.
And then hoping that by the time I'm done with that, it'll be over, maybe?
Yeah, let's hope.
Let's hope.
Yep.
Yeah.
So you're originally from Canada and then by way of Tennessee, do I remember that correctly?
Kentucky.
Kentucky, yeah.
Close. They're right next to each other. Yeah, Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
So I was in Kentucky for 8 years. I was in Indiana for 3 years before that. And then before that, I grew up in Canada, did my undergrad and master's in Canada. And now I'm in Minneapolis.
Right, a little bit closer to home.
Yeah. Not to where my family is, but closer to the border at least. So if I
Mm-hmm.
have to like run for it or something, I can.
That doesn't sound very patriotic to me, but we're not here to talk
Hey,
about.
I've been in the States for 11 years. I really love it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I do.
Mm-hmm. And I first heard you on my men's coach, Connor Beaton Man Talks podcast. And I just had to reach out because there was a major takeaway from you and his conversation where we were talking about disclosing past trauma with a current partner or a future partner. And that's why I have 2 pages of notes. I'm not going to lie. Like, there's probably like 5 major takeaways that I'd love to address today.
Yeah.
But before we do, let's get into why you chose to extensively research this topic.
Yeah. So, sexual trauma impacts so many people more than we really even know. And so, first of all, that it has like a wide reaching implications for everyone. And then many people are partnered with people who have experienced sexual trauma in some way or another. And I just thought it was really important, especially given the increase in attention to sexual trauma through things like the Me Too movement and the Time's Up movement. It was really important to think about many of these people are actually thriving in their sex lives and are thriving in their relationships. It's not like, yes, it's a traumatic experience for sure, but where's the resilience? Like, where's the conversation around resilience and like how people have been resilient, and because so many people have. And so that's what the research started with, the intention around like, how do we talk about the ways in which we might have an opportunity to learn from people who have experienced sexual trauma and learn from how exactly they moved on to a healthy relationship.
Yeah, and when we were chatting last week to get to know each other better, that's the angle and the lens at which you view your research is through healthy, happy relationships later on down the road.
Right. Yeah. I think we can learn so much from couples who are doing it right. Right. So
Mm.
instead of always focusing on like the risk reduction or on, the negative communication cycles, how about we learn how to engage in some of these positive communication cycles? And how can we learn from couples who are really satisfied in their sex lives and who are really happy?
That's a great way to reframe and take a different look at it. Um, Bring it into the positive light instead of always having a negative connotation around it. And that, to me, is like a sign of true growth, is when we can reach towards that perspective, as opposed to, we're never going to arrive at 100% healthy, whether we have a trauma background or not.
Right, right. So I think about it in terms of like the self-actualization piece of when you get to a point where you really are truly living your best sexual and relational self, like life, and you're feeling your best self in that context. Because the risk reduction work is very important, but it's also really being done a lot. I feel like there's a lot of researchers that are focused on that because that's where a lot of the research funding is, frankly. And so, my work isn't funded nearly as much as that, but I've been very fortunate to be in academic positions where that hasn't been sort of a driver. I can do the research that I want to do and have that support of the university, which is where these types of research programs are able to thrive, rather than like relying on what the government happens to be funding at that time.
That's incredible, and thank you for your dedication to that pursuit of knowledge. And let's get to my first takeaway of my 2 pages of notes, if not more. I mean,
Okay.
I can only see 2 pages in front of me, but my first highlighted point is that there's a pursuit of pleasure after trauma. Can you explain that just a little bit more?
Yeah, one of the things that we really found in the interviews that we did with women, these were with women. So, although I certainly think that this is applicable beyond women, was that there was, once that sort of healing process began, then there was this really interesting look at sexual pleasure. Like, we were interested in understanding how they define sexual pleasure, because we think that that people who have experienced sexual trauma are uniquely positioned to talk about sexual pleasure because they have had sex without consent, without pleasure, and that sexual experience that didn't have the consent and didn't have the pleasure associated with it really makes someone acutely aware of when pleasure can take place, when there can be space for pleasure. And so we found that the insights available around like what was important for sexual pleasure and for the pursuit of sexual pleasure was really insightful. We have a paper coming out on that topic, and one of the main components of that is around safety. And like, safety doesn't seem very sexy, but it is quite sexy, actually. Knowing that your partner respects you and respects your boundaries and really is looking for active consent. That's really, really sexy. And so I think that there's just a really unique position that these individuals are in to be able to understand their sexual pleasure on a deeper level.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just blown away. I mean, I'm fascinated by the extent at which you've uncovered those facts, and it leads us into our second point of, I had to write furiously fast when we were talking last week, so it's all scribbled. But once you get past the walls up and the exterior protective shell that I can imagine that trauma survivors have at some point when they're meeting new people, once you get past that shell, then disclosure can be with immense vulnerability when they start to talk to their partner about it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is and it's a particularly, can be an intimacy generating conversation, because of that vulnerability and because of having those walls down. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And fun fact about both of us, we're the challenger on the Enneagram type. And the word vulnerability, it doesn't come to us easily.
No, it sure doesn't. Walls up is a very familiar term.
And I think that that's why it stood out at me. And that's why I wrote it down in the same way that we were talking about it. And of course, we can chuckle because we have that frame of reference, but that might be a foreign concept to people unfamiliar with the Enneagram, but also people who come to vulnerability easily.
Yeah. hmm Yeah. And I think when it comes to disclosing sexual trauma, too, there are different ways, different personality types are going to approach that very differently. For some people, it may not feel like an intimacy thing. That disclosure might not have that kind of meaning that it might for you or I because of us normally being pretty walls up, pretty closed book.
hmm Definitely. And what I took away from our conversation, this is probably point number 3, is that the new partner does not need to assume that therapy is necessary.
Right. I think the individuals who's experienced sexual trauma, they know where they are in their healing process. Maybe they've already done extensive therapy. Maybe they've done a ton of self-work that you don't even know anything about. And that's where making any sort of assumptions around that, or sort of like being that knight in shining armor to come and save the day. I mean, come on. Just like people have their own autonomy and they've survived perfectly fine without you before you arrived. They're gonna survive fine when you're gone. Like, that's just not the approach that should be taken. Instead, it should be more of like a open conversation around like, wow, I appreciate your disclosure of that. Where are you with that? Asking questions instead of looking for solutions to that. There might not need to be any solution. It might just be a disclosure.
hmm I totally hear that for sure. And what I wrote down in my notes is this direct quote of facilitating comfort for your partner when they do disclose.
Yeah, yeah, that's
And
cool.
that could be a really hard thing um, for their partner to do. So what does that look like? What does facilitating comfort feel like, sound like?
Yeah, it can be different for anybody. So different people are going to want that in different ways. So there's no real formula for that, but I think getting to know, asking your partner if there is anything that would bring them comfort, um, asking, and also one of the things that really came up a lot was with this disclosure piece, you know, making sure that you're not responding in sort of like you're a victim or like you're, in that kind of way. Like, seeing many of the women talked about like not wanting their partner to see them as broken, like after this disclosure. And so focusing instead on the resilience piece and like focusing on, wow, the fact that they've shared that with you, that's to me the more productive sort of way of going about dealing with this sort of disclosure, instead of, yeah. And I think caring sort of looks different for everybody, and just asking that question of what does me caring look like for you in this particular moment. Like, I don't, this is new to me, this is,
hmm
and it's okay to admit that something's new and like that you don't know how to handle it. um so yeah, I think
hmm
that's the best approach.
So you're saying that going into helper mode may not be as effective as having a safe place for them to come to you and open up, and then receiving that information and disclosure with empathy.
Definitely all of those things. What you just said, tied in a bow.
I didn't know. I nailed it because
Nailed it.
I tried to take such good notes because we were just like, I think we were in the zone when we were talking about it, and just super fired up from both sides. I think um, you, because you had just moved to Minneapolis and I caught you like during an errand, and then me because like I almost feel like our community and our audience would ultimately just want to save this, take a lot of notes, and then just this would land with our audience so
Mhm.
much. So I'm really grateful that you took the time to chat with me again.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here. I'm glad it resonates with people.
I'm for sure it will. Over the last year or so, after meeting some influential people in my life that showed me what empathy was when I disclosed um, my history to them, and it was almost like a new and unfamiliar feeling for me. Oh my gosh, is that what empathy feels like? Because maybe in the past there was an experience for a new partner of mine where I emotionally dumped information onto them. And
Mhm.
that's kind of a buzz phrase, or like a common phrase being used nowadays about over disclosing, or maybe not having that right container or environment to have the conversation.
And I think some of that sometimes happens when a person is still working through that, right? So it doesn't happen as much if you have really done the work to work through your feelings around it. I think if you haven't done that yet, and if you do still maybe need to go to therapy, and you do still need to work through how you place meaning on it and like how it functions in the context of new relationships, then I can see that emotional dumping being something that would happen, and that might not bode well for a relationship, because maybe you're not like ready to be in that relationship. That might be an indication of that. I don't know.
I
Does that,
totally,
does that
I,
fit with what you sort of experienced? Okay.
I totally agree that, like, I love Brene Brown. She's just been a huge influence, and I know our audience does too. So she calls it oversharing, but there's like a deer in headlights kind of response from a partner when you may share too much too soon, and there's no standard timeline for disclosure at all. So if it's within the first 3 weeks, that's comfortable for the both of you. But um, I I took notes, and I wrote down the phrase safe container too. So what's the best way to ask for the space with a new partner? Hey, I'd like to share something with you.
Yeah. You could say that flat out, like, I'd like to share something important with you. Can we take a moment to sit down? I think that that might, that could scare someone and make someone think like, oh my gosh, what are they going to say? Like, I think maybe bringing it up maybe a little bit more organically, of you're sitting, having a relaxing night together, like you're not high stress, like, because then if you set it up as that way, then it might set up these expectations around, and nerves around, like, oh my gosh, what is this thing, right? It kind of builds it up in a way that might not be the best approach. But if you feel like you need to prepare your partner in that way, then I think, then you do what you need to do. But it wouldn't probably be the way that I would go about it. I think in a more casual setting of, you're both relaxed, you're like feeling like you're feeling close to the person, you feel like it feels like the right time. I think that that's just like an internal feeling of, and in that moment maybe you say like, I'm going to share something with you that has a big influence on my life, and I'm going to talk about the ways in which it does, and I want you to know that this is me being vulnerable. I feel like for us
Oh
sometimes
yeah.
we actually do have to say those words. Like, you know this is me being vulnerable, like, this is my walls down. And so actually saying those words and then putting yourself into that from there. But to warn someone of a safe container of that, I think might put up some alarm bells potentially,
Okay.
around, and fear. Like, I think it might put up some walls, actually, some fear around the walls.
Okay.
Mhm.
Yeah, definitely. You and I both appreciate direct communication, don't we?
Yes.
Like, this is what the next 10 minutes is going to feel like for
This is
you.
what it's gonna look like. This is what I'm gonna say. Can you listen, please? Yeah.
Yeah, of course, you and I are laughing about that. People might not understand the joke, but
Yeah.
but as challengers, we just love direct communication. That's how we verbalize it, that's how we receive it. And I could definitely understand your point of, okay, there's some alarm bells going off with that lead-in phrase of, I'd like to share something with you. And going back to talking about sexual pleasure from the trauma survivor's perspective, and you use the word sexy, it can be sexy.
Hmm.
And there's another word that,
Consent and safety can be sexy. Yeah.
say that again.
Consent and safety are sexy. Yeah.
Awesome.
Hmm.
And I think that the boundaries around our conversation today can be sexy as well.
Hmm.
Of like, hey, me as the discloser has some boundaries, and then the receiver has some boundaries too. And the talk around us making a safe container and emotionally dumping on your partner kind of leads me to kind of understanding the boundaries that can be placed around privacy and disclosure. Walk me through
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. And I think also, like, even if you were to disclose to a new partner something along the lines of, like, I've previously disclosed this and it felt like emotional dumping, I don't want it to feel like that for you. So here's some things that I'm doing to try and make sure it doesn't. That is great, and like that can really facilitate intimacy and allows for you to say, hey, this prior experience I had in disclosing this wasn't that great, and here's the reasons I think that was the case. I want it to be different with you. That is, communicating to your partner that you care about this going well and that you're invested, and that investment, and that commitment to wanting it to go well can go a really long way.
What does support feel like from their perspective? Yes, empathy we talked about, and facilitating comfort when the trauma survivor is actually disclosing their history. But what is that partner support, maybe the week or two or month or year after that? Now that they're opening the doors of vulnerability and generating some intimacy there, how does the partner best support them?
So our research showed that, that was really individual. So for some people, that meant that every single time, that when they would get into a sexual situation, there were certain positions or there were certain sexual activities that kind of had a bit of an alarm bell to it that the partner then really respected and made sure, like, checked in with the person to make sure that that was okay at that time. And so that is really something to be negotiated between each couple. And um, for some people, it didn't necessarily look like anything. Like, it was just, regular emotional support from a partner over the course of time that was not any different than emotional support you might offer just generally. And then for others, it was those, like, very specific communication around boundaries. And there was one specific example given around, like, coming up behind her and giving her a hug from behind, and that was just something that, like, really, like, just set off her alarm bells. And so then he knew that, and that was something that he always did prior to the disclosure. And once she finally was able to talk to him about it, it was like, what a relief. Like, I don't have to feel like I'm rejecting him. And she was always feeling like it was a rejection when it wasn't really a rejection. It was just this thing. And so there's just communicating those specific pieces during that disclosure conversation and just saying, here's the ways in which this might play out in our relationship. And maybe those ways are none, but maybe there are multiple ways that it might. So talking about that for each individual couple will really dictate the support that needs to be given along the way.
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
Yeah, it sounds like a conversation that could happen in any type of a relationship too. Uh, not not exclusively to one trauma survivor or both trauma survivors.
Sure. Mhm.
In a naturally occurring, um, people who have a relationship that have never experienced that.
Yeah.
I think that sounds like healthy boundaries to me.
Totally, which is why I think the interviews that we did with these women were so fascinating, because I did think that they really applied outside of sexual trauma survivors. I think that it was, um, this definition of sexual pleasure, for example, that question that we asked about how they define sexual pleasure, what are the components necessary for sexual pleasure to exist? I think those same components are listed by everyone if they really stop and think about it. It's just that so many people haven't been faced with the need to really think about what sexual pleasure means to them, right? So people within the LGBTQ community, for example, like, there's no script really, for like, there's this very heterosexual script that we have for heterosexual cisgender people that is clear about what happens first and then what happens and then what happens. But within the LGBTQ community, there's not that same script. And so they have been faced with having to think about what sexual pleasure means to them. And so I think that really, like, this meaning of sexual pleasure is far reaching, and safety is at the core of it. We can't experience pleasure without feeling like that vulnerability can be there, and like that real like opening to another person in a very intimate way can happen, and that there's space for that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, very well said. Absolutely.
I feel like now is a good time to take a break. As you guys may know, I'm a certified strength and conditioning specialist here in Denver, Colorado. But because of coronavirus and the quarantine and gyms being a relatively unsafe place to be nowadays, we have created bodyweight workout programs that you can do anywhere, anytime. To apply for the upcoming Bodyweight Warrior program, head on over to fitlifechampions.com and click Apply Today. You and I will sit down one-on-one and just learn more about what your goals are currently, where you want to be, and we will put a plan in place together to get you to that goal, whether you sign up with us or not. Again, if you're looking for at-home workouts via Zoom with a personal trainer one-on-one, or to do anywhere, anytime at your own pace, head on over to fitlifechampions.com and sign up for a complimentary consultation with me today. Let's get back to today's episode with Dr. Kristen Mark.
So during that supportive experience from partner to partner, there can be a need to resist the temptation to put your own stuff into that safe container, and I wrote it down on like from the perspective of the receiver putting their stuff onto the discloser.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Walk me through that just a little bit deeper.
Yeah, I think, well, it's, we all have stuff. And so I think knowing what your stuff is and like being introspective about that, and knowing where your limits are around that sort of thing, knowing what you're comfortable with, and that can all be, that can all really help minimize the extent to which you might emotionally dump into the other person's space on that, right? So I think maybe the conversation that we had the other day about someone getting really defensive, right? Like you say, this happened to me, and the immediate response is something like, well, who was it? Like, are they in jail? Like, what are we going to do? We need to do something, that is usually that person's problem, not, that's their own stuff being dumped into there. It's not anything about the disclosure you make it about, then that makes it, it's then not like about the vulnerable space that was created. It then gets shifted into this sort of thing that somebody's probably already thought about 100 times before they disclose to you, and like is not relevant actually. Yeah.
Got it. It sounded a lot like that white knight that you were talking about earlier, of like coming in to save the day. Well, our partners don't need to be saved.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
But if they have disclosed to you, and they also may include during that disclosure that like, hey, I feel these certain things coming up in me, and I am planning to go back to therapy for those things. How's best to support your partner as they go back to therapy and as they work through what's coming up for them?
So so I'm a couples therapist, and so I am a very strong supporter of couples therapy, even when you're working on individual issues. I think that it can be hard to be in a relationship with someone where maybe one of you's really working on themselves and the other one's kind of not, or they're like passively working on themselves. So I am always in support of both members of the couple going to therapy together, so that they can work on the relationship while they work on their individual needs. And so that would be one way to be supportive, is to do that with your partner. And I also like I'm biased because I am a couples therapist, but I think there's real benefit to healthy couples having like a 6-month checkup. Like if any long-term relationship I'm in, I'm always just like a proponent of, okay, we're going to have like a 6-month checkup with a therapist just to have that check-in. But to support each other, I mean, again, I think it's pretty individualized for what they might need for that. But especially if it was a reaction to a disclosure, I do think that does warrant some couples stuff instead of just individual. Yeah.
Yeah, I respect that view of even healthy couples doing check-ins regularly, individually and as a couple too.
Yeah. Yeah.
If they're both growth mindset focused,
Right.
then it should not be a problem.
Exactly. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, couples therapy and therapy in general is not just for when a problem arises. It's like getting an oil change. Like you need to get an oil change for your engine to run well. So
yeah, preventative maintenance on your mind, your heart, your soul, your relationships, and I believe it bleeds into every other area of our lives too. You know, my daughter just turned 18, and I feel as if her life was benefited because I spent 20 months in counseling.
Right. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And she spent her own time there as well. And her life benefited. And my life benefited because she participated in her own growth.
Yeah.
Yeah. She's a rock star.
Yeah. That's awesome.
So the one question that I have that's not necessarily like going to have a positive note on it is when that intention of disclosing sexual trauma may not be for relationship building. And we could probably bring emotional dumping back into that. But another reason why I like Brene Brown is that not everybody has earned the right to hear your story.
Mm-hmm.
And transparency without boundaries is truly manipulation, I think, is another one that really stood out from Daring Greatly, I believe is where that came from.
Yeah. Yeah. Great book. So I love Brene Brown as well.
We could spend like 40 episodes on just
Yeah. And so understanding your motivation behind it is crucial. Like knowing why it is that you're looking to disclose. I think the very it can be harmful to a relationship if you are just, it can be manipulation if you are just dumping for a particular reaction or for to gain some sort of control in the relationship, or whatever that reason might be. I think understanding your motivations behind it is pretty important here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, truly understand that. I can appreciate it as well. And that covers my 5 or 6 main points and my takeaways from chatting with you previously. What haven't we gotten to? Because I'm holding back on some fun topics that I want to end with today, but I want to give you the floor and open it up to what's the most important thing that we should take away from today's conversation.
I mean, especially related to the experience of sexual trauma. And I think that taking away the fact that it is complex and every single person experiences it differently. Like so often I'm asked for, one sentence of wrap this up, like, and give me one sentence of what people should do in this scenario. And I think the real sentence that I would give is communicate with your partner about it and get to know them truly and deeply, and know them on a level that ends up creating that safe space for sharing. Like there isn't a formula for this. And so the only formula that does exist is that clear, direct communication, and really making sure that you understand one another on a deeper level. So many people go through life and relationships that are really surface level. And I think for some people that's okay. But when you're getting into the processing of things like sexual trauma or trauma of any sort, that is a deeper emotional hurt that does need depth. That can't really be dealt with in the context of a surface level relationship. So it is necessary to do that hard work and it can be uncomfortable, and like to sit in that discomfort. And so that would be my takeaway, is like communicate about it and get deeper on it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. You did mention direct communication in there, which is music to my ears as an 8. Getting deeper, not so much.
Right. Well, me neither. That's really hard for me. Like anyone who I've dated who happens to listen to this is going to be like, yeah, Kristen. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And what I hear from you is that you started to learn a little bit more about your Enneagram type from the Chelsea Handler book. Is that correct?
Yes, I did. Yeah.
Because she's proud, loud and proud about being a challenger.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But she alluded to the not so great caricature of the Enneagram 8, and that's our current president, Donald Trump.
That's right. Yes. I don't like to think that I have anything in common with him.
Agreed. And what I like to playfully hold true to myself is that, like, if that's the lower levels of health for an Enneagram 8, and I stay far away from that archetype, then I think I'm trending in the right direction.
So at least we have a clear example of that. That's great. Yeah, that's a good way to spin that.
It's the way that I can sleep at night, being a challenger.
Yeah.
So what does it look like when, through the lens of the Enneagram, what does it look like when you're operating at your best?
So I would say like definitely the direct communication, feeling like all of my ducks are in a row, and feeling organized, and yeah, I think that's in general. Now, if there were I'm trying to think of specific contexts to give an actual example, but I'm having trouble coming up with one.
Can I lead you towards something that's on my mind? I love to talk to people and talk to people about why they chose their profession.
Yeah.
And the specific niche that you chose within your profession is true to form a healthy version of an 8, is where we champion for the little guy and we root for the underdog. And I don't know if there's a bigger underdog out there than the people that you do research with.
Yeah, that's true. And I do I think also an underdog in that is just doing research in the area of sexual pleasure and satisfaction in general. Like, people are very uncomfortable talking about sex, and it's not something, as I mentioned, the research funding, like to get a study funded that studies sexual pleasure is just like not a funding priority. And so it's an underdog in the samples that I work with, but also in like the topic area of just being something that so many people shy away from. But really, I think if we could all be more comfortable talking about sex, and if we could all understand the importance of sexual well-being to our overall well-being, we would be a way healthier society. Even if we do look at the risk reduction stuff, if we were to eliminate unintended pregnancy, or at least decrease it substantially, we would, make a pretty big dent in poverty, for example. So what's a bigger cause than that? So, yeah, I think I definitely chose the right profession, and I'm very, very passionate about what I do. And that, when I'm burnt out, and then I can feel it. And I think that does have a lot to do with just my personality. And I need to be passionate about what I'm doing, and I need to be motivated by it. When I'm burnt out, I just know that I need to switch it up. I have to do something a little different.
I can relate so much because the podcast, like um, we're rooting for the underdog every single week on the podcast is like an advocate for mental health through the lens of our relationship. And one of the tools that we use is the Enneagram. And that's part of my life's purpose of starting this side project that I'm very passionate about. And then within my profession, my day job, my career as a personal trainer, I've worked with all different types of underdogs. In the
Yeah.
sports world, the sports analogy, there's always a winner and a loser. Well, I'm working with the underdog. I always root
Yeah.
for the college team that's not supposed to win the football game, Appalachian
Sure.
State versus Michigan.
Sure. So there's the sex is baseball metaphor.
First
Um,
base, second
yeah,
base.
yeah. So there's a great TED talk that I show my students, and it's about like changing the metaphor from baseball to pizza.
Okay.
And it just talks about how problematic using sports metaphors in sex is, which it is so problematic. Like sex is not about like winning or
Rounding the
losing
bases,
anymore.
right?
It's not about a game. It's not like you've succeeded by getting
Mm-hmm.
to this point. Like it's not about a game. It's a destination, and there's not winners or losers. Like there's so many sex and sport metaphors that are so problematic. So you should look up that TED talk. It's Al Vernaccio, I think. But
Thank you very much. I'll put it in the show notes below.
yeah, it's a really we should use pizza.
All right, tell me the
Pizza's like my
pizza.
favorite food group. So
Uh-huh.
yeah, so the pizza metaphor talks about like, when you want to get pizza, even if you've been with a partner for forever, you still say like, hey, so do you want to get the usual? And so you can talk about sex in that way too, right? You want to do the usual, or are we going to spice it up this week? And then things like you do actually talk about what toppings you might want. You aren't looking for, it's not orgasm centric. It's not like are you satisfied? Like the question isn't did you win or did you round the base, but rather are you satisfied? And so that's how we should also be shifting our approaches to sex is, are you satisfied? Did you have an orgasm or not? Sure, yeah, that's a bonus if you did, but also if you focus on orgasm, you're less likely to have an orgasm. So let's focus on pleasure and satisfaction, and that's what you do with pizza. So yeah, I'm fully on getting sports out of sex.
Yeah, and the sports analogy that rings in my mind from my memories of high school and middle school is, oh, did you score?
Yeah, exactly.
So I totally am on board with this pizza analogy because as an 8, I want to eat the whole thing.
Yeah.
Right? But I could most certainly be satisfied with 2 slices.
Yeah.
And not eating the whole thing, but sharing it with a partner.
Yeah, there you go.
And saving the other half for tomorrow.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
And we can get a gluten-free crust.
Sure.
Or we can get a white sauce or a pesto sauce or
yeah, really
local
mix it up as much as you want.
local pizza shop that has a fig and pig with like fig sauce with prosciutto ham and arugula.
Oh, yum.
Yeah, now we're talking about food.
Yeah.
But is my mouth watering for the pizza or for the analogy?
You can answer that.
I've got all afternoon until jujitsu class, and then I'll just ponder on it.
Yeah.
Definitely. So let's backpedal just a little bit because I wanted to ask you a question about sex education.
Yeah.
And you tied in poverty as the big underdog that you fight for. Like if we get ahead of this on a sexual education standpoint, then down the road we could prevent those unwanted pregnancies, and then also in turn helping the poverty cause.
Right.
So,
yeah, because so much of unintended pregnancy fuels the poverty cycle. People who have an unintended pregnancy aren't prepared, obviously, for that. And so therefore, and unfortunately, children cost a lot of money. As you have an 18-year-old, you know how much money children cost. Very expensive. And so for people to be thrust into parenthood without the preparation that they may have wanted, then that just really fuels that poverty cycle. Unintended pregnancies, especially to people like teen moms, much higher rate of dropping out of high school, lower educational attainment. Like, it just really sets one's life on a different path. And that's not always terrible, but it often is, actually. It often does perpetuate this poverty cycle. And unfortunately, unintended pregnancies are much higher in lower socioeconomic classes. And so that is also part of the problem. The access to things like contraception is just not as available to people who are in lower socioeconomic class. When health insurance is tied to your job, that's a real problem if you're unemployed, right? So, and especially in, the US ranks #1 in the world for unintended pregnancies. We have the highest unintended pregnancy rate of any developed world or developed nation. And so we really are failing when it comes to both sex education and getting people on effective contraceptive methods, and teaching them about those methods. My undergrad students, I teach an undergrad sex ed class, and a lot of it is remedial from like myths that they learned around contraception, with like thinking that you can't have a baby if you have an IUD, like it's not reversible, or that there's all of these myths around, or the birth control causes cancer. No, it actually prevents more cancer than it causes. And so there's all of these myths out there, and we just don't have a robust sex education system, or like any sex education system in the majority of places, to kind of really try and make a difference at the ground level, like when kids really need to learn this information and be equipped with the information to make choices for themselves that work best for their lives.
Yeah, it sounds like you're really passionate about the topic.
Yeah, I could talk about it. I like have to stop myself because I'm just like, I get pretty fired up about it because it makes me so mad. It has such a solution to it. And people's lack of comfort with sex, or with talking about sex, or thinking that by talking about sex to kids is going to make them have sex for some reason. I mean, that's just not the case, I teach a program in the Netherlands each summer, a study abroad program. I take students to Amsterdam, and we learn about their model of sex education. And the Dutch, what they do is they have comprehensive, inclusive sex education from preschool onward. And those messages in preschool come back to the sexual trauma messaging, because those messages in preschool are about good touch, bad touch, and why you need to ask for consent for all of these things. And that builds the foundation that's so crucial for when you get older, that we just do not build here. We don't have a consent culture built here. And they really have that built in. And so, they have the lowest unintended pregnancy rates in the world. So
that's a good model to duplicate here. And one angle we could maybe remove from our culture is the closed lip or tongue in cheek, kind of avoidant nature of talking about sex.
Yeah, definitely. We're not gonna be seeing any of that change, unfortunately, until we get away from this like shame-based messaging around like purity culture, and like, oh gosh, there's just so much shame and guilt wrapped up with sex and sex ed, and like, it's awful. Slowly but surely, hopefully that can be chipped away at. That's been my mission anyway.
Sounds like we could handle a lot of business with just that one bit of education. And if you were in charge, how would you take care of it?
I would be teaching it from preschool onward, and I would have open conversations and have the ability to have it in schools. Like, schools are just they reach all children, right? That should be a priority. And unfortunately, it just doesn't have room in they indicate that there's no room in the schedule, but you know, would you make room if you knew that you could prevent all of these unintended pregnancies and people from dropping out and never getting their education? You know, also, I think we need more of an equal approach to it. So like not separating genders. That doesn't need to happen. Everyone should get to know information about everybody's bodies. That's not something that should be secretive. We should know how each other's bodies works. You know, men should know where the clitoris is. That should be something that is taught, given that so many people are heterosexual. And, you know, I think that should be integrated into our education system.
I'm dying over here. That was fucking hilarious. Must have struck a chord for some reason.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I
But
wonder
like,
why. Why did you find that so funny?
I almost fell out of my chair over here. But like,
Yeah.
as a heterosexual male, and a recovering nice guy people pleaser, I mean, hell, it was almost like my personal mission to find that body part and to ask a lot of questions.
You, right?
What's that?
If only you would have just been taught that in like grade 5. Here's a diagram. Yeah.
Well, I can imagine, or if I transport myself back to that time, I remember the anatomy being taught. But what the hell am I supposed to do with that?
Right. And I guarantee you that they did not show you where the clitoris was in that anatomy lesson.
It's possible. I mean, I don't have that good of a memory, and I just turned 4.
I'd be really shocked if they did. Yeah.
Let's see. In like middle school era, I was in Virginia, which was a fairly progressive location, more so than Montana, where I'd moved from. And then coming back to Colorado is more of the Midwest values. That Virginia was a culture shock. You know, we were getting that education in 4th and 5th grade. Yeah.
Well, moving from Canada to Indiana and then to Kentucky, I had quite the culture shock myself. Yeah, I was definitely told a couple times, once actually only, but to like just be a little bit more Southern. My direct communication style did not bode well for the South.
If you could do your best impersonation of a Southern accent and say the word out or about.
A Southern accent I cannot do. I'm like, my Canadian accent will come through unless I'm saying the word y'all. How y'all doing down there? I don't know. Yeah, I cannot impersonate accents. Every accent that I ever do, actually, no matter what accent I'm trying to impersonate, is like a mix between Irish and Indian. Like every accent that I ever do. So I'll just sound Irish, Indian Irish or something if I try and impersonate that.
Let's see, you and I are getting a kick out of the last 10 minutes of the podcast episode, but I don't know if Enneagram 1, the reformer, would actually be entertained right now, but we're going to find out.
Okay, good.
The emails that I'll get afterward.
Comments, yeah.
That's right. So if your message resonates with our audience, what's the best way for them to get a hold of you?
So they can reach me through my website, which is kristenmark.com, or on Twitter, Kristen_Mark.
Thank you very much. And if there's one thing that we briefly touched on or didn't get to today that you want to leave us with, what would you like to share with us?
I think, maybe listeners could just have one like uncomfortable sex conversation. I think based on what we just talked about, if they could just try and break that barrier of having like a meaningful conversation about sex with someone and see how that goes.
Challenge accepted.
Okay. Good.
Okay, so what if I already did that this week?
Like by our conversation right now.
Okay, I've already done it. I've already done it twice this week.
Then maybe you're just getting really good at it and you should continue having these hard conversations.
That's funny.
Yeah.
I got a lot of gratitude for you spending the time with me today, and a lot of gratitude for the last 6 or 7 months that we're sharing collectively now. And dating in the era of COVID is incredibly hard and nerve-wracking, and I think that just the fact that it's on everyone's mind, at the forefront of their mind, is like a great introductory conversation to having the sex talk later.
Yeah.
Hey, what are your boundaries around dating right now? And that's a question that I like to ask anybody I'm going to coffee with or lunch, or
Right.
um,
Right.
who else are you kissing right now?
Yeah, that's a super important question. Or like, who are you
Mm.
seeing indoors? So I'm doing a study right now, actually, where we're collecting data on people's sex and relationships during COVID. And it's been really interesting. We collected like 5 or 6 waves of data over the course of the pandemic. We did not expect it to last this long.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Initially, we were kind of like, yeah, we'll do 6 waves. I'm sure it'll be over by then. No, it was definitely not. And, you know, single people are doing a lot more related to this, like, you know, dating via video and just like getting to know each other on a deeper level before they meet in person. Although I think now there's a lot of people, and I don't know, I haven't looked at our data to see if this has shown in our data set, but I think people are getting kind of sick of it. At least for me, my experience has been, when at the beginning of the pandemic, dating during the pandemic was very like strict and like, okay, let's do like video calls and then maybe we'll get together like outside and go for an outdoor walk. Whereas now it's feeling a lot more like people are sick of it. And that's why we're seeing these spikes again. But, you know, those boundaries are getting less, I would
Mm-hmm.
say, current now.
Mm-hmm.
And especially thinking about going into the winter without like, really, like, this is it. You know, this is all we have left of outdoor, so like, let's get all of it that we can.
Uh-huh.
And I think those barriers are kind of coming down right now, but still important to remember that there is a pandemic out there and we need to be careful while still getting emotional needs and like intimacy needs met, and like physical touch matters. Like, that's something that is important to our well-being.
It really does.
Mhm.
And I can see your point to the spikes over the course of time, over the course of summer, and then we're adapting to our new scenarios, whether we're working from home and we're like, oh my gosh, I'm craving that physical intimacy, or I'm just craving intimacy in general. And then outside of who I'm dating, it's also a factor of like, my jujitsu teammates are important to me, my roommate, my daughter's health, my parents.
Yeah.
They chose to move entirely up into the mountains to get away from their Denver suburb home, sold it off in June. And that's a great decision for them, but I would still like to go visit them.
Yeah.
So what's your work life like? What's your social life like? Who else are you dating? Are you dating anybody else? Is almost a faster question for me now than ever before, with more confidence as well.
Right. Yeah. We have this like really important reason to know that information. Like, that's really important. Yeah. It's life or death, literally.
Safety and boundaries are sexy, guys.
Yeah. Safety and boundaries are sexy. Yeah. Consent is sexy.
All of the above. I love it.
Important.
Dr. Kristen Mark, thank you so very much for coming to spend the time with me today.
Yeah. Thanks
And
for having me.
it's a pleasure. Let's catch it back up in like 6 or 12 months from now and see what your research is telling us about our 2020 experience and beyond.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks.
Thank you.